All right, let's talk about Battles from the Age of Reason after my first playthrough of a game in the series. Something that has been on my list for quite a long time in terms of what I've wanted to do and experience and learn. And now that I have completed the Battle of Malvitz from the Battles of Malvitz and Katoositz, which is a 2017 Clash of Arms production, I just wanted to give my initial impressions and reactions to the system, to my experience, what it plays like, and maybe provide some insights into those of you who've been looking to dip your toe in but have been intimidated or are unaware of this series for any number of reasons. So first off, let's talk about my general impressions of the system. I'm going to move this, and I might pick up the camera a little bit as I do this. So here's the rules of play. This is the third edition. It comes in at about 41 pages, but it is, as I've said in the videos, incredibly dense. It is really more of a rules reference than it is necessarily a learn to play. That has its advantages and disadvantages, but learning to play from these rules is pretty difficult. I am going to say that if you're newer to war games, even newer to tactical games, I would say that learning to play this from someone who knows the rules is a much better experience probably than trying to learn it from the rule book. There's a lot of minutia in the game. There's a lot of charts and tables, and knowing when to apply the appropriate charts and tables given the situation that you're in, and sort of all the little things that different unit types might affect the changes in the rules is a lot to come to grips with, especially if you're playing both sides in a game that has all of that stuff. Now, I did get into the flow, and I think once you get into the flow and start playing it, it does become a lot more intuitive. I have told some people that as we look at some of the areas of the battle here at the end of the game, I have told some people that learning this game to me felt a lot like learning OCS, in that once you get over that sort of initial complexity and difficulty hump, a lot of the rules fade into a really intuitive space, and you start to just understand intrinsically how to play the game, what phase you're in, the little nuances of each thing about units or phase or whatever in the rules, and it also reveals itself like OCS does, at least for me, as you play it more. It reveals a depth of gameplay that I found very satisfying and very fun. So in that regard, I highly really like it. And it's a shame that the rules here are not a good teaching aid. While they are detailed and incredibly complete, it is, it's all black and white text, and it's really like the kerning and letting here is tight. So it took me 3 days to read through this because it is pretty dry as more of a technical manual. My recommendation would maybe to, like I said in my video, is, don't really necessarily kind of read through cover to cover and play it. I would just kind of get some counters out and start pushing them around, especially if you have one of the tutorial scenarios, which Malvitz has. There's also a tutorial scenario in Fontenoy, if you can find a copy of that game. They will let you come to grips with it slowly in small scale rather than trying to take a big chunk out of it. Now that feel like I'm pretty adept at learning rule systems, so I wasn't too intimidated to take a chunk out of it, but I was still intimidated because this was not an easy read. Okay, so what else do I like about it? Well, the narrative of the gameplay is really strong. So as you saw in my playthroughs, lots of unexpected things happened. The game engine is built in a really interesting way in that anytime a 0 is rolled on a die, usually in the game 95% of the time, there's going to be some special narrative event that happens, whether that's the initiative, there's some extra initiative that one side gets. You run out of ammo in your artillery or infantry, you get extra rolls with fire combat, or the melee goes inexplicably against you as the defenders find some resolve or the attackers botch an attempt. So if you like Blind Swords, if you like the way that the chits in that game and the surprise unpredictability of the combat unfolds, I think you would really like this. It is maybe Blind Swords on steroids in the sense that there's a lot of special events that can happen in any given situation. This is just initiative special results, infantry fire, artillery fire, defensive fire, completely different. And then, you've got potential leader losses when stuff happens. You've got, pursuit special results if someone's pursuing There's another, this is just one page, there's another chart of special results. If you're doing a disorder check, depending on whether what you're doing the disorder check for, you can get all sorts of special things happening that sort of like change up the narrative flow of the game. And then you've got a whole nother chart for morale check special results, depending on what you're doing, whether it's from fire combat or close combat, or before close combat, or charge, or retreating, or eliminated or routed attackers, or friendly units retreat, or opportunity chart. Like, you can just see that there's so many different special results here. And some of the criticisms that are leveled at the system are that it's so frequent that you can roll a 0. It is that you get a lot of these. Now, I didn't find it too bad. I thought that actually the special results were one of the most fun parts of the game, seeing what was going to happen to my carefully laid plans, or to my, something I thought was going to be a sure thing, my strategic brilliance, and suddenly it goes awry. Now, if you're playing face-to-face, that may be less compelling to you, but you can't deny that the game gives a very, very strong narrative journey to both players as they're playing it. And I think that you'll get different journeys every time you play even the same scenario. If I set up Malvitz again, knowing what I know, I would probably have much different results in the battle, maybe even at least early, but certainly throughout, with different things happening to different units. And so I really, really, really love that about the system. It's telling you a story while you're playing the game, and it's not fixed. It doesn't get into it. It doesn't ever feel static. There's always something crazy that can happen. As far as charts go, the terrain effects, have so many different effects on the game based on movement and what formation you're in and what type of unit and whether or not you're cavalry charging or pursuing, on combat as well. But I do really like the core system. I do think that, having the strength point firepower based on distance here is really nice. It's pretty easy. Fire combat's pretty easy. You know that you can never fire with more than 4 strength points out of a hex. So even though this unit might be a 6/4, you know when he fires it's going to be 4. And then based on your range, you start to internalize the range thing pretty quickly with your infantry units, because you can only fire usually at 2 hexes. And there wasn't a lot of artillery in this battle, so I didn't really have to look at this too much. But the fire combat resolution was really painless after a while. The chart is really easy to read. Most of the time, you're not going to have much of an effect. If you do, it's usually 1 loss. Sometimes a morale check, sometimes not. Internalizing the modifiers, typically you don't ever use the modifiers unless something bad has happened. So partial line of sight happened only a couple times. The disordered one I internalized pretty quickly, your half firepower. We had no howitzers. Stuff like this. There was no general order in Malvitz. Enfilade, I had a couple enfilade fires. That was pretty nice. And then, the main one you want to look at here is defensive fire. That's the one you really want to make sure you include when you're doing defensive fire. And what's interesting about fire combat is that it's based on the terrain that the units are in, not based on the units in the hex necessarily, unless you are really dense. So, it's the fire combat's quite nice. It's based on manpower, not necessarily anything else, and so you can start to resolve it pretty quickly. I am going to talk about the formations because that does change things up a bit. I did start to use hook formation and multi-hex lines. Each game is going to be different in terms of which nationality and how they had their army organized, whether you can form multi-hex lines or not. As we saw, the Austrians, most of their infantry, in fact, all their infantry could not form multi-hex line, whereas the Prussians could. That really helped get more firepower per unit onto the Austrians, and it was a big reason why the Prussians ended up crushing the Austrians as well. But these are nice little reminders. I think the fire combat here, this chart, if you've ever played great campaigns in the American Civil War, you'll be kind of right at home with how to read some of these charts. Kind of similar in practice in some senses, in terms of the way you read it, not necessarily the effects. Close combat is kind of a bear. This is where you get into a huge sequence of play that has a lot of different moving parts. You're rolling a lot of dice when it comes to close combats, and trying to remember which combats you're doing and stuff. It could be tricky. But like I said, it does give a lot of narrative flavor because the die rolls can be very swingy. Oftentimes you're finding that the defender or the attacker is routing, so they can be very risky if you're doing close combat. You only want to do it if you have real superiority. And even then, it's not a sure thing. But going through these steps involves a lot of things, and potentially it could take you a long time. Close combat is really where the game slows down. That's another thing I want to talk about is the pacing of the system. You got to be prepared to be in it for the long haul if you're playing a scenario. If you're playing a bigger game, you're going to be playing it for days probably, if not weeks if you're soloing it. This is a slow-moving system, and while it does give you a really nicely detailed, rich narrative picture of what's happening, it is not the most playable system in terms of getting it done. like in one sitting or even in two sittings potentially with the bigger games. So you have to be comfortable with the fact that you're going to be having a lot of slow moving action and that the battle unfolding is going to take some time to show you a different view of what you're used to. But in general, I really think the combat systems they're so different. The fire combat and the close combat here is different enough that it really gives you a feel for the period and some of the challenges and considerations that the army commanders would have been thinking about when they gave these orders to charge and whatnot. I wouldn't say maybe I don't know if it's a perfect simulation per se, but I do think it's a great moving towards the simulation aspect. What else? There's a lot to remember when it comes to the thing that really tripped me up early was the difference between disorder and morale. Those are two different unit states, and knowing when to check for one versus the other it can be confusing, especially when you first start learning. Typically speaking, disorder represents like something you're doing that messes up your formation, and all of the different ways, criteria that will cause you to check disorder are found on this sheet here, as well as what being disordered means for your units, and some examples about movement pass-through, which is the main way you're going to get disordered in this game, or one of the main ways. But disorder, like figuring out what disorder means for your units, I was constantly getting that confused with what being shaken means, because shaken is from morale and disorder is for unit organization. And so that is maybe the most impenetrable part of this game, is trying to remember what all of the effects of shaken and disorder are. Now, I did pick it up towards the end of the game. I started to remember it and internalize it a lot, but it's going to take a lot of repeated play to understand that. And there's a lot of situations as well for morale where you're going to have to, remember how to check your morale. Thankfully, this chart does a good job of giving you all the modifiers, but still, this is a big chart for one aspect of the game that may or may not apply at any given situation. So the morale disorder system is a really nice 2-vector way to represent unit cohesion, but it is also makes the game way more detailed and process intense than other war games that you might have played, especially tactical. As you can see, this spiral-bound book, I printed this copy off from the BAR website, but there's a copy that comes with the game that's not in color. These are the lost charts. There's a lot of material in this, and any game is going to have a comparably sized, in the series, is going to have a comparably sized charts booklet. So getting comfortable with these charts, not being intimidated by how much information is here. These are actually made to help you play the game without referencing the rules. And for the most part, they do a really, really great job. So I would recommend that if you're going to play this series, you go to the BAR website and you download whatever game you're playing's most current version of these are, because they've put out, for 3rd edition, they've upgraded some of the older games from the 2nd edition to the 3rd edition. I don't know what the difference is, by the way, between 2nd and 3rd edition, because I've only started learning with 3rd edition. But by all accounts, it's supposed to be an improvement and a streamlining of the system. So that's one of the things I wanted to mention here, is that a lot of the stuff I can find on YouTube about this system right now is pretty outdated, because a lot of those playthroughs and a lot of those impressions videos are using the 2nd edition rules, which the things that people didn't like about those may or may not have been smoothed out with the 3rd edition. I can't say because I don't have any experience, but I did not find that I shared some of the complaints that other people who have done BAR videos have had with the system personally. But I also play a lot of complex games, so I realized that I could be in the minority there. So these charts are really important. Getting familiar with the way they're laid out and what kind of information they're conveying, it actually becomes really easy to play the game just from the charts once you've internalized a lot of the rules. Bigger games are going to be more complex. We did miss a lot of stuff in Malvitz that is not present in other games. So, for example, we did not have attack column, which is really important in the 7 Years' War titles in the series. We did not have very large charge ranges with the cavalry because we're in the snow. And we didn't have any special leaders in this scenario, for example, that might have special effects and can only be activated under certain conditions and so forth. So there's still a lot to the system. Skirmishers, we didn't have any skirmishers, I don't think, in this scenario, and they have some different abilities compared to normal units. So, and also, we didn't do a lot of formation changes. I mean, we did some, but the game, one of the things that the game is known for is being really detailed when it comes to formation changes based on nationality. So you can see here, for example, once you start getting into multi-hex units, which we didn't have a lot of opportunity, we had some opportunity with the Prussians, but I never really had to make any formation changes with them, or I chose not to. But when you do, there's a lot of, these diagrams help you calculate the movement point cost of how to do that, depending on which direction you're turning. So you can see here that if you've got a 2-hex infantry unit in march column and it wants to turn into line, depending on which direction it turns and based on what nationality it is, you're paying different movement points to make that formation change. A lot has been made of these charts being like, whoa, I can't believe this game is so detailed that you have to have a chart for how to turn left. And while that is true, what these are really is just a shortcut visually to get you to the point where you can do these formation changes without having to do a lot of math. That's what these are really for. And so while I do appreciate the detail into the system in order to make this possible, but it may be too much for some people. I fully recognize that. The other side here has the movement point cost to switch between different formations if you're not multi-hex. So this was really useful in a couple situations. I tried out the march column, and road column a few times. Helps you with artillery limbering and unlimbering, and the changing facing diagram as well. I didn't consult this too much, honestly. I think part of that is Malvitz is not a battle that lends itself to a lot of formation changing just because of the snow movement stuff and how the armies are sort of arrayed at the start of the battle. But I can see if you play the approach to battle scenarios, you would need to use this a lot more because you're probably going to be in column as you approach enemy forces. But this is, again, another really good thing to have because you can just look at the chart and make the change without having to do all the math. And that is meant to make the gameplay smoother, right? So, yeah, what do I have to say? I think that's kind of all I have to say. Oh, the loss chart. So, yeah, that's the one other thing. So, you can either do loss charts or you can do strength point reduction markers. I find practically that you probably want to do both when you're playing. I didn't use the loss charts in my game. I was simply doing the strength point reduction counters. The problem is when you make an army morale check, you have to then go count underneath every stack to make sure you've got the right number versus if you just look at the army loss record, you'll know. Now, the problem is if you just use the loss charts, then you fall into the problem that the 7 Years' War battle system games have, which is like anytime you go to do anything with a unit, you then have to consult the loss chart for their particular unit and see what their strength points are. So practically, I would say that you probably want to use both. If you're playing the game, this makes it easy to calculate those turns where you need to do army morale checks. This makes it easy to determine a unit status at a glance. And additionally, when you're doing the army morale checks, you also have to calculate on the map number of units that have strength points that are routing. And if you use the markers under the units, you can easily calculate that by looking at the unit versus having to check the board and then check these sheets. So your mileage may vary. You may find one way to do it versus another that's better. But I personally abhor looking at the map and then having to check the information that's being displayed on the map with the loss charts. I just absolutely hate that, so I prefer the counters. But these are really nice to use, and you can, photocopy and make copies for every time you play the game. They're really useful. One other aspect of the system that I want to talk about is the way the turns are structured. Every turn is 20 minutes. This is going to be familiar to people who played Labatai. Now, I haven't played Labatai, so if you're looking for comparisons with that system, I think some of the basics involved with command and control and the increments limiting how much stuff can come out of a hex in terms of attacking, that's going to be very similar. The visual style is obviously very similar. But in terms of the activation system and a lot of other things about this, I don't know how it compares to Labatai because I have not played Labatai. But I think if you play one or the other, you could probably make the jump based on what I understand of Labatai from one series to another pretty easily because a lot of the concepts are similar. So I really like how the game models fatigue into the turn track. Earlier you start in the day, the longer the turns are going to be because the troops are more fresh. And as you go hour by hour, the turn track shrinks and the end of turns shows up more and more frequently, which is a really cool way to build in that without any extra rules to the game. I really love that. In particular, this turn track for this particular game is really well done because it gives you the command rating and wing activation number for each commander, and then space for if that changes. So you can just look at a glance without having to go to the rules or the loss charts. And also it gives you a scenario setup. So older games in the series don't have this, but I really like this turn record track. Also, the component quality, let's talk about that real quick. Everything in this series has always been high quality. You'll remember at the beginning of the year at Game On, I picked up a copy of Colleen, which is volume 1 of Bar, and that was anticipating me getting into this series about an era that I really love. Colleen was printed in 1995. I have since picked up most of the other ones. The only ones that I'm missing are the American Revolution games, so Monmouth and Germantown Brandywine. The quality of Clash of Arms products has been good since the 80s, right? Their maps and counters have always been top tier. It's really the supporting documentation that's come the longest, and I feel like Malvitz and Katusitz has really demonstrates that in terms of the in-game components. The counters are absolutely gorgeous. Part of the reason I got into this series was just how visually impressive the uniformed counters are. It's the same kind of appeal with Labatai, right? It's the same idea. I just love the way the game looks on the table. You've got sort of all the pomp and circumstance and pageantry of the era, military uniforms. Like some people say, well, how do you even tell what's going on? Well, when you're playing the game, you know that units facing one direction versus another are yours, but the backsides of the counters, as an example, show you whether they're Prussian or Austrian based on the backside. That is similar to La Bataille, and that some of the unit information is found on the back, but I don't think it's as bad as in La Bataille because the backs of these counters really only have 2 numbers that you need to worry about, which is the efficiency rating of the unit, which is used for all sorts of checks, morale checks, and recovery checks. And typically they're going to be between 20 and 40, typically. So you don't ever, frequently as you're playing, you'll get into a rhythm where you know when you roll that, like, if it's, 50 or higher, unless you're in a really severe morale penalty situation, you're probably going to pass it. And so you don't have to look at the counters, the backs of the counters every time you make a check for every single unit. I found I never had to do that for the most part. It was only when it was close that I needed to check. And then additionally, you've got the red, which is the close combat modifier on the back of the unit. You only need that when you close combat, which may or may not happen a lot. But in general, the information conveyed by the game is pretty like apparent when you're looking at the game, and obviously it looks very beautiful. They have added in the newer games the command belt here on the uniform to show which command it belongs to. So as you can see here, this leader has sort of a purple or blue command belt, and this unit here has a red. So I just know by looking at the counters that he is not part of his formation. But it can get a little confusing when you get a situation like this, figuring out, especially if you're under shaken markers or disorder markers, what unit is belongs to which command and which leader and whatnot. And some of them are very similar. So here we have a yellow belt with a blue buckle, and here we have a yellow belt with an orange buckle. So it can get a little hard. I did put the status markers on top. I wish the status markers were in color because it does kind of wash out the game when you have a bunch of units under these markers, but you could also put them underneath the unit. I just like to know what status they're in at a glance. So that's why those are there. But in general, Clash of Arms does an amazing production job. The map, the paper on the map and the art on the map is just phenomenal. It's got like that parchment style, and the close-in artwork of the villages and the terrain is just like so evocative. It's the reason that people play these games, I feel like. Even the box as well. The newer boxes are quite nice. They also have like a linen finish to them, and the artwork on Malvitz I think is the best in the entire series. I think that this cover is just fantastic with Frederick holding the banner. I really love what they did with the artistic treatment here. So yeah, I'm really looking forward, by the way, to the new game in the series that's going to be coming next, which is going to be Battles of Quebec. It's going to be a series of smaller battles around the city of Quebec throughout the years, and it's going to include the Plains of Abraham, which is the end of the French and Indian War, essentially, which is awesome. And it's also going to include Benedict Arnold's assault on the city in 1775, which very few games ever tackle, and which I've been dying for a war game to tackle. So I'll be there day one with a pre-order for that. Game. It should be noted that there are some scale differences between the games that take place in Europe and take place in North America, but it's kind of moot because the North American ones are a little hard to find right now. The easiest ones are going to be probably Malvitz and Prague because those are the newest. One of the things that I wish Clash of Arms would do is reprint some of the older ones to make them more available. I think this series is really good. I would definitely play it again. I could definitely see myself falling down the rabbit hole and making this like a staple of my convention circuits or at my gaming club of people who are interested, because I think this system is really evocative and fun to play with all of its small details that it's modeling here. You can tell that there's passion behind the designers and publishers for this series for the era. And there's so few games in this era, especially heavyweight games, that cover some of these conflicts like this, the War of Austrian Succession, that I'm always happy to support it because I think it's a really interesting period of warfare before you get to Napoleonics, but after sort of the pike and shot era, that doesn't really get remarked upon a lot, but it featured a lot of really interesting tactics and equipment-related considerations for the commanders. What else do I want to say? I guess the only other thing I would say is that I think more people should give this series a try, or find someone who can help you learn it, or find someone to learn it with. There's a lot of the recent games come with accessible scenarios that you can make the on-ramp a lot shorter, or a lot less difficult, I should say, to coming to grips with the system's idiosyncrasies. But it is a very, very well designed and developed tactical system for this period. The other thing I would add is, how does this compare to some of the other games from the Age of Reason that we played recently where I analyzed how it reflected the linear formations and stuff. So I won't go into that exact comparison yet. I will come back and do that in a future video. But the one thing I will say is that I do think that the game reinforces linear tactics with very, very steep penalties for not maintaining your formations. First of all, you get a morale boost when you've got units who've got on their flanks good order units next to them. So keeping your lines straight, keeping them tight, having the units maintain cohesion is the path to victory. That is how you win. That is how you beat an opponent who is a little bit less organized. You want to keep all of your stuff lined up as evenly as possible, so you're getting those morale bonuses. You're able to do defensive fire with multiple volleys. It really rewards the tactic of massing your fire combat against targets. When you start to get disorganized like you do in here, it's really easy to get flanked, and flanking has severe penalties in this system. So units getting flanked are almost always going to be routing. And so through the gameplay, it reinforces the linear tactics and linear doctrine of the era, which I do appreciate. There's no special rules for how that is accomplished or how that is incentivized other than, the way that the game plays. But I do think it's very strong. It's much stronger than we saw in the Via Victis series, which had the same kind of thing, but it wasn't nearly as expressed, nearly as coherently or directly as we see here. I think the battalion scale of this system is really good, especially when it comes to having multiple battalions of the same regiment and the way that affects command and control and the way that affects operating together. I think that's really interesting. And I think the formation changes here, having hook formations, like all these different formations that you saw in this era be a part of the movement system, really lends itself to the feel that you have these like linear formations and commands that are, very strict on how and where they can go and what they can do. Cavalry is a little more loose, as you would expect. I do think that the cavalry impact in this game is seen much more when cavalry fights cavalry, which is what you would expect. It's usually a bad idea to be charging your cavalry into mass musket fire across a line. So that's also incentivized in the gameplay as well. And I think it finds a really nice medium between like cavalry can do nothing, like we saw in Piacenza 1746 against infantry, and cavalry can do everything, like we saw in the Via Victis series that covers this period. So it really blends a lot of the elements that I've looked at and we've looked at together in some of those other games into a really nice feel. It feels very period appropriate while not being like difficult to play in the sense that like you can still execute maneuvers and tactics within the rules in a very like free-flowing and responsive context. So I really am impressed. This was something that was very intimidating to me, but I'm just on such an age of like romantic age of enlightenment kick right now that I couldn't say no anymore because the games are so beautiful, and I figured I should give it a shot. So those are my initial impressions. I will come back and maybe do another video when I play Mel tomorrow, later this week, and maybe revisit one of the other one map games, Katu, which is the other game in this box I'm very excited to play, and also Lobo Sits, which is another single mapper but a much bigger battle with a lot more counters. And I think that's kind of the appropriate ramp to get to something like a Fontenoy or even a Prague, or even a Zorndorf, which is a really big one. So I hope you enjoyed this look. I know there wasn't a lot of visual interest in this video. Like I wasn't doing a lot of show and tell. I tried to show as much as I could, but this is a great system. I'm really impressed with my experience with it, and I cannot wait to play it more. I thought it was really fun. Despite the heavyweight nature of learning it, it really provides a compelling experience on the table.